The Furby sat in the middle of my bed. There was barely any fur left on it, and its once brown eyes were now blood red. I slammed the door shut as it began howling. Grab your flashlight, everyone, and get rid of all the toys in your house, 'cause these 5 scary toy stories will give you nightmares tonight. I live in a fairly large, split-level home. The wife and I sleep on one side, the kids on the other. There are 3 bedrooms and a bathroom on the kids' side. It all started when I heard a strange sound late at night, coming from the other side of the house. The sound was children singing, but not like the kids messing around, more like a toy. I couldn't figure it out. I let it go a couple of nights, but it began to happen more frequently at night, so I decided to investigate it. I made my way across the other side of the house, through the kitchen. I usually go this way as the oven clock is on and I can check the time. It was 4:32. As I got closer, I could hear tapping or fumbling. I carried on. I hate the dark. I reached the other side and noted the tapping was coming from the bathroom. The door was ajar. Inside was my daughter, fumbling in the dark. She hears me and immediately turns around. In a quiet, tired voice, whispers, "Daddy is broken." She was referring to a toy baby bath. It has lights and sang a jiggle along with splashing sounds. She was right. I turned it from try me to off. I thought I should remove the batteries as I had a similar problem looking for an attractive kids book that kept me awake. That, however, didn't have an off button. I figured this would do. I took my little girl back to the bed and we all slept well that night. A few days passed with no more interruptions, and I eventually forgot about the rogue toy. Last night I got home late, so I was tired. I felt bad for not kissing the kids before bedtime, but I had to put my head down. However, last night I heard it again. I was pissed. I love my sleep. This time I wasn't messing around. "I'm taking the bloody batteries out," I muttered to myself. I walked briskly over to the other side of the house. I heard the tapping again. I suspected it had awoken my little girl again. I made my way to the bathroom in the dark. It was pitch black as the lights on the toy were no longer working. The batteries must have been really flat. I made out the silhouette of my little girl and walked her back to her bed. I noticed she was wanting to go to the 3rd room. She seemed really dozy, cold, and was probably tired, so I gently led her to her bedroom. I sat on the end of the bed where my son's feet were. Once I knew she was asleep, I went back to the toy, found my trusty screwdriver, and removed the batteries. It was 3 a.m. I noticed the battery compartment was rusted, obviously caused by being in the bath or playing near the water. I went back to bed. I was awoke again. This time, it seemed after only 5 minutes of sleep. I heard the same sound, tapping again, louder. What? Did I leave a battery in? Did the kids put the batteries back in? I was tired and confused. I went back to the kitchen. There was a toy in the same place I left it. I decided this was it. I picked it up and decided to put it in the garage. As I carried it there, I heard the tapping and splashing sound again. Except this time, it wasn't the toy I was holding. It was coming from the bathroom again. I looked up. I made my way to the bathroom. I had to check it out. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. Nothing. The dark room seemed empty. A shimmer caught my eye from the bath. The bath was full. I decided to empty it. I reached inside the bath to drain it, I recalled it, feeling deeper than usual. I reached deeper for the plug, pulled at it, as my elbow went below the water line. I felt an arm grasp at my wrist. I instinctively tried to pull away, but I couldn't. The little hand was pulling me down. Concerned about what the quickly drained water would reveal, the next moment I managed to pull away, the nail scraping and clawing. As I escaped its grasp, the water continued to drain. I felt compelled, magnetized, transfixed to see what was below the water. The water bloodied with the result of my cut wrist. The red water drained further, lower and lower. I leaned in to see what could be there, as the water seemed too low to accommodate anything. I leaned in more. The water gurgled, swirled, and the last drop of red drained away. Nothing. The bath was empty, apart from a red haze. My arms, they were fine. No marks, no blood. I put this event down to a crazy nightmare. However, the ordeal kept me awake most of the night. I didn't hear anything for the rest of the night. That's my story. I'm writing this in the morning, before I head to work. You know, you can never tell the story as well the second time round. As I go and wake the kids for breakfast, my wife explains not to bother. They were having a sleepover at the grandparents'. I am changing names and dates for the sake of privacy, but I'm sure you've seen it all on the news. I have to explain this before they take me. I am crazy, according to the many psychologists I've been over the past few years, and many police officers who didn't believe the story I'm about to tell you. I promise you, it is true. I would never do what I'm here for, especially not to her. I'm sitting here, awaiting death row. What have I got to lose? If I did anything, I would cough it up. But I didn't. I'm innocent. It all started when I was 17. I was lonely, isolated, from a broken family, rural area, worked at the butcher, the basic crazy person blueprint. I was okay though, good grades, reasonably happy, and had one very close friend. Her name was Abby. We did almost everything together. If she was having a good day, I'd stay at her house a lot. She'd stay at mine. A lot. It wasn't what you think though. We weren't together. We just caught each other. It's so hard to explain to someone who isn't her. Abby was a very, very sad girl. Depressed. Chronically. She never laughed. Never. And smiling was a gift sent from the angels. She barely came to school, which is why I went to hers a lot. I loved her very deeply. I'd begged her one day, after school, to come to the mall with me. I sat on her bed, cross-legged, and she lay tucked into her bed. The usual state for her. She shook her head. Mike, I don't want to. I sighed. I'll buy you something if you come. Something awesome. I took a few extra shifts at the butcher's this week. I've got some money. So? She looked at me, up and down. I cut her off. You do want to. You won't let yourself want anything. It's not a big deal. It's half an hour at the mall. I hated invalidating her illness, but sometimes it was the only way to get her to leave the house. Please, Abby. She sighed. Fucking fine. She threw the covers back, her thin pale frame, struggling, chucked on some fresh clothes and grabbed my hand. When we arrived at the mall, she seemed in better spirits. She didn't seem as pissed at me as she initially was. We walked around for 10 minutes. I bought her a smoothie and a new t-shirt from her favorite band. She almost had a skip in her walk. I walked and then turned to face her, to say something along the lines of, "You okay?" when I heard the most baleful laughter I'd ever heard. Abby wasn't next to me. She was about 10 steps behind me, pointing and laughing. I followed her point to the poorly dressed clown. I walked to meet her, still laughing hysterically at this shady clown. I looked him up and down. He was wearing a rainbow suit, big pom-poms as buttons, and red nose and drained hair coiled into an afro. His face was painted white with 2 orange stars drawn over his eyes. He was holding balloons, 3 red ones. He was standing next to a desk with a man sitting behind it. Next to the desk, a sign that read Mr. Giggles. I shuddered. Clowns grossed me out. But Abby hadn't even stopped to have a breath between all her laughing. I asked the man behind the desk what he was doing, why this clown was here, why there was nothing but him and the empty desk. He looked at me, seriously looked at me. Deep in my eyes, his for rent. I furrowed my eyebrows. "You're renting this clown?" "Yes. Are you interested?" I looked at Abby, still pointing and laughing. I couldn't believe how much joy she got out of this clown. I shrugged my shoulders at the man. "I think I am, actually. How much are you asking?" "Not a lot. $20. For the clown?" "For the clown." I scrambled to my pocket and pulled out my wallet, handing him $20. The man thanked me and wished me luck. Mr. Giggles shuffled towards Abby and embraced her. She smiled very hard through her laughter. Looking me in the eyes, she thanked me without saying a word. "I'll take you home. I'm staying tonight to make sure you're okay." Abby's parents were absent this week, on some sort of couples retreat. I always blamed them, partly for Abby's illness, because they didn't care enough. I walked her to her front door and turned the lock. Abby, still laughing, holding hands with Mr. Giggles. We walked upstairs and she continued to laugh, bellowing hysteria. I ducked back downstairs and got her a glass of water from the kitchen. All the laughing surely was wearing her out. She must be thirsty. She tried to drink the water, still laughing hysterically, and it turned splitting water everywhere. I really didn't get what was so funny. He was a shit-looking clown, terribly dressed, poorly painted, and looked to be an old man. Somewhere in his late 60s, maybe. Over the next few hours, I asked Abby if she was hungry. She shook her head between laughs. I asked if she wanted to put a movie on. Same response. I asked her so many more things to try and get her attention away from Mr. Giggles to no prevail. I shrugged my shoulders. It was around 1 a.m. by now, so I decided it was time for bed. I laid Abby back in bed and tapped her hand as if to motion good night. She nodded, still laughing. I went downstairs and set up a makeshift bed on the couch. I must have fell asleep very quickly, because the next thing I awoke to is why I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night since that day. A scream. The kind of scream you hear when you are terrified for your own life. It was Abby. I sprinted upstairs, shifting my pants, trying to come up with an action plan for whatever I had to help her with. I ran into her room and fell to the floor. Abby looked as though she was sleeping, so peacefully, in a red stream of her own blood staining her bedding. I looked to the window, where the clown was now standing, shedding a perfect dark silhouette of his tall figure over Abby and the bed. He stood, balloons in hand, bellowing deeper and darker than he did when we first met him. When I was a kid, my parents gave me a bright red old landline phone that has ceased to work long ago. Mom said I played with that thing all the time. She said She often heard me mention the name Mr. Smith a lot. Of course, she just brushed it off, as it was likely that I had an imaginary friend because I wasn't too great at making real friends. I remember a distinct memory where I was just playing in my room when I heard an unfamiliar Mommy told me to never answer the phone, but it couldn't hurt to answer my toy phone, could it? I picked it up. "Hello?" I answered. "Hi, is your mother home?" A deep smoker-sounding voice answered. I knew that 1, I wasn't supposed to talk to strangers, and 2, I wasn't supposed to answer the phone, but Mommy or Daddy might know this man, so I called for her. She rushed to my room, probably assuming I was hurt. "Someone wants you," I explained, handing her the phone. She held it up to her ear, smiling, thinking I was playing a game. "Hello?" I heard the same deep rumbling noises coming from the phone. Mommy's face went pale and slack. She set my brother down, told me to make sure he didn't get hurt or eat anything, and ran upstairs to alert my daddy. A couple decades later, on a Mother's Day, Mom suddenly mentions this story to me. She didn't tell me anything he said, other than he told her his name was Mr. Smith. She still won't tell me anything else. Not much later, a friend of mine told me a Mr. Smith wanted to speak to me. Coincidence? But the freakiest part is that a Mr. Smith just called. He asked why we never talk anymore. If there is one thing everyone knows about me, is my fear of dolls. I hate them. Their soulless eyes and cheeky psychopathic smiles are enough to send me into a full panic attack at a moment's notice. My parents always thought my fear was irrational, given the fact that I personally used to own a lot of them. A traumatic memory that has long been forgotten, obviously. Now, my niece loves dolls. She even collects them, placing them in glass cases around their room, a room I never enter when I visit. My sister always yells at me when I come over. She doesn't want me to fear to rub off on Bailey. "You are 26 years old, Sarah. Time to grow up," she would say. But I will never grow out of this fear. Last night, my sister called and asked if I could watch Bailey, as she had some hot date with a dreamy lawyer. I teased her about it before saying yes. I really didn't have anything else to do that night, anyways. I pulled up to her house later that evening and was greeted by an enthusiastic Bailey. "Sarah, guess what? Mommy gave me your old dolls." I wrapped my arms around my excited knees and glared up at my sister, who was standing in the doorway with an apologetic look on her face. As I approached, she shrugged at me. "What? You weren't using them anymore, and Mom thought they needed some love." I shook my head with disgust and walked through the door, giving her a shove as I went. Bailey was jumping up and down, pigtails bouncing in the air. "Do you want to see them?" "I know Gracie has been asking about you," she says. "She misses you." My little niece looked up at me with hopeful eyes. I shuddered, but before I could reply, I felt my sister shooting daggers into the back of my head. I peeked over my shoulder. Sure, Bailey," I choked out. My sister smiled and grabbed her coat. "You two have fun," she shouted before heading out the door to her car. I let out a dramatic sigh as Bailey grabbed my hand, leading me to her room. I began to feel nauseous as she opened the door. "Stop it, Sarah. You are going to scare Bailey." My sister's remarks floated into my mind. I followed her in. The room was just as horrible as I imagined. Beady little eyes stared at me from every angle, and I shuddered as I closed mine. Bailey began tugging at me. "Look, Auntie, remember her?" I slowly opened my eyes to my niece shoving an old porcelain doll into my face. The doll had hair as black as her soul with eyes that seemed to lock onto mine, as Bailey bounced her excitedly in front of me. Her never-ending smile was the one that haunted my dreams, sending shivers throughout my whole body. She was terrifying. Had this really been my favorite doll? Bailey placed her in my hands. She was as cold and limp as a lifeless child, and yet as alive in my thoughts as any lurking creature. Feast upon every lost inch of my fears. I was frozen in place. Fear had started to take over my whole body when Bailey finally took the demon doll back, breaking the petrifying trance I was in. I looked down at my niece, who was now stroking Grace's hair lovingly. "I want to play hide and seek," she said. Perfect, I thought, as I walked towards the door. "I want Gracie to play too," my niece called out, before I could reach the safety of the hallway. Why?" I replied under my breath, not wanting to upset her. "We'll hide first," she excitedly announced as she ran past me, Gracie in tow. "Start counting." When I had walked far enough away from the room of nightmares, I began to count. When I had reached 30, I called out, "Ready or not, here I come." I heard a giggle coming from the coat closet, but pretended to look everywhere else before announcing I had found her. The game went on for an hour before I remembered it was well past Bailey's bedtime. I found her one last time before looking at me with a horrified expression. "Did you find Gracie?" I looked at her confused. "What do you mean? I thought you two hid together." My niece yawned. "No, she wanted you to find her for yourself." "You have to, Sarah," she sleepily replied. I rolled my eyes and told her I would look for her after she went to bed. My niece seemed to accept my answer and bounded towards her room, but not before she shot back. "Gracie said if you don't find her, she will find you." A shiver ran down my back like tiny little spiders crawling along my spine, causing goosebumps to rise all over my body. I made my way to the kitchen, pulling out a pint of ice cream. 2 hours passed before I heard my sister's car pulling to the driveway. When she walked in, I told her about my horrible night and how Bailey had really freaked me out with the dolls. I also sarcastically mentioned that she had hidden Gracie somewhere in the house, winking at her as I opened the door to leave. I laughed a little, thinking about my sister finding her in her bed or something, scaring the crap out of her. As I drove back to my apartment, I began thinking about all the nightmares I was going to endure that night. I blasted some Lindsay Sterling trying to ease my fear. As I parked my car, a thought crossed my mind and I reflexively looked into the back seat. It was empty. I sighed and got out of the car, almost mad at myself for letting the shit get to me. As I approached my apartment, I stopped. My door was ajar, with the inside of my place encased by darkness. Tapped upon it was a folded-up piece of paper. I reached for the note, slowly opening it, with my heart racing in my chest. A lump immediately formed in the back of my throat as I read it out loud, tears filling my eyes. 3 little words written by an elegant hand that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "I found you." I like to collect things that remind me of my childhood. I occasionally wander through yard sales or thrift stores looking for old toys, like those I once owned, trinkets similar to the kind my grandmother collected, or old souvenirs from places I visited with my parents. This hobby of mine usually produces nothing but happiness, but last summer it was the source of a nightmare. I found it at some little old lady's yard sale, somewhat hidden between a box of old baseball cards and a milk crate full of beat-up action figures. People always joke that Furbies were creepy, but I absolutely adored mine. When I was a kid, I considered it more of a friend than a toy, and would spend hours talking to it and stroking its fur. While I held the black and white ball of fuzz in my hands, I could not help but to remember the tea parties and games of house that I played with the pink one I carried everywhere 15 years ago. The little old lady that I bought it from didn't seem to remember having it, but happily reasoned that my grandkids accumulated so many toys here over the years, I could not possibly keep track of everything. I politely listened as she told me about 2 grandsons and 3 granddaughters, how they used to visit every weekend until they grew up and moved on with lives and families of their own, before heading home with my newest treasure. I played with the Furby for a while, giggling at the childish gibberish it spoke, and running my fingers over its still soft fur. The white on its belly was kind of dirty, and the fluff on top of his head was missing more than a few strands, but it worked well and made me so happy. I placed it on a shelf in my bedroom before eating dinner and going to sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a kind of hissing sound coming from the door. I removed the batteries and went back to bed. The next day, I replaced the batteries and it seemed to be working fine again. I ran my fingers through the white fur and vowed to be more careful with it when a clump of that fur came off in my hand. That night, I woke yet again to the hissing sound, but this time it was louder. As I approached the Furby, I realized that it was whispering in its own little language. I figured that wasn't a stretch for a toy so old and well used to malfunction, so I removed the batteries and decided to only have them in when I was actually playing with it. My little problem was solved for the time being. 3 days went by. I had been busy with work and such, and had not paid much attention to any of the toys on the shelves. I had had a friend over for dinner and grabbed the Furby from my room to show it to her. We joked around and she messed with it for a few minutes while I cooked before she commented on the state of it. "I know you love this thing, but wouldn't you be happier with one that's not in such bad shape? There are patches of fur missing and it's dirty." I knew about the bit missing from the top, but I could have sworn that the 2 dime-sized bald spots that she pointed out hadn't been there before. Perplexed, I mumbled something about it being well loved before putting it back on the shelf and finishing dinner. After my friend left, I settled on the couch to watch some TV. I heard a thump come from somewhere in the house and muted the show so that I could listen for the source. Just as I was about to shrug it off as nothing and turn the volume back, I heard another thump. I armed myself with the umbrella I keep by the door and slowly made my way into my bedroom, wondering what kind of intruder would stop to play with his victim's toys. It giggled again as I entered the room, ready to strike with my improvised weapon. There was no intruder, and the only sign of something being amiss was the Furby on the floor in the middle of the room. I checked every possible hiding spot, listening carefully for footsteps or other signs of not being alone, before turning to leave the room to check the rest of the house. Right before I walked through the door, I heard the voice of the toy behind me. "Bleed." I turned to the toy as a shudder ran through me. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I had heard it correctly. The lids of his eyes slowly shut and reopened before it spoke again. "Die. Bleed. Die." I picked it up and practically ran to my front door to throw it outside. As I shut the door, I heard it laugh again. I tried to continue watching TV, but the little monster on my front lawn prevented me from focusing on what was happening on the screen. After about an hour of jumping at every little noise and nervously glancing at the windows that looked out at the yard, I went to bed and spent the night dreaming about tiny fuzzy demons attacking me. The next morning, I sleepily got ready for work while still trying to shake off my encounter and the nightmares it caused. I opened the front door, intending to not even glance at the thing that sat somewhere in the grass, and froze in my tracks at the sight of my front porch. The Furby sat in the center of the front step, surrounded by blood and clumps of light brown fur. Its yellow plastic beak had a small piece of meat hanging from it, as if I had caught it mid-bite. It had lost a lot of fur, so much that I could see the plastic underneath, and what was left of it was matted and brown. Sitting inches away from the door's tiny feet was a dead rabbit. Its body had been picked clean to the bones, and only the head remained intact. Beady little eyes stared into nothingness. The tip of its tongue hung from the side of its mouth and rested on its own blood of the porch's wooden floorboards. I turned away from the gore and gagged as I slammed the door. After running into the bathroom to lose my breakfast, I called out of work and debated what I could do about the tiny terror. My friends and family would think I was crazy. The police would probably take me away. I came to the conclusion rather quickly that I was on my own. I grabbed a couple of garbage bags and some cleaning supplies and cleaned up the mess on my porch. The first thing I did was bag up the Furby and put it in the trash by the curb. The garbage man would take it away the next day, and just the thought of that made me feel better. The rest of my day was quiet, and the horrors of the morning were a distant thought by the time I went to sleep. I was jolted awake by an ear-piercing shriek. I looked around my darkened room, trying to figure out where the sound came from, when something slammed against the door so hard that a picture fell off of the wall next to it. The wailing continued as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone as I pressed the numbers. I screamed and covered in the corner when another slam on the door cracked the wood in the center, threatening to split it in half and let the assailant in. Silence filled my home, but the operator stayed on the phone with me until the police came in case whoever was trying to break in was still around. The cops found my doors and windows still closed and locked, and once they came in, their search of the house turned up nothing as well. After taking my statement and telling me to call if anything else happened, they left. Knowing that I wouldn't be able to sleep anymore that night, I went to grab the blanket off of my bed so I could curl up on the couch and watch a movie. I turned on the light in my bedroom and almost jumped out of my skin. The Furby sat in the middle of the bed. There was barely any fur left of it, and its once brown eyes were now blood red. I slammed the door shut as it began howling. It shouted the words bleed and die over and over as it threw itself against the door, splintering the wood along the crack it had made earlier. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house. It was the middle of the night, and I had forgotten to grab my phone and wallet, so I decided to drive around until it was a decent enough hour to knock on someone's door and ask to stay there for a while. Before long I was getting delirious from lack of sleep and decided to pull over and rest my eyes for a while. It wasn't until I looked around to make sure I was alone that I realized where I had stopped, right in front of the house of the old lady that sold me the Furby. After arguing with myself for a while, I decided to talk to her in the morning. As I closed my eyes and tried to ignore how uncomfortable it was trying to sleep in the front seat of a car, I thought about how I could get information from her without seeming completely nuts. Before I knew it, I opened my eyes to bright sunlight shining through the windows. I checked my hair in the rearview mirror, stretched my arms and legs, and then walked up the short sidewalk that led to the house. I opened the screen door and knocked and was surprised when the inner door swung open a bit. I called out a greeting before pushing the door open a little further. When I stuck my head through the doorway, I was assaulted by an awful stench seconds before finding the source. The sweet little old lady who had sold me the Furby was lying on her back in the center of the living room floor. The color in her once brown eyes had paled and glazed over, and her sagging skin had begun to turn grey. My entrance had spooked a large orange cat that had been tearing away at the skin of her cheek and mouth, leaving a jagged hole through which I could see her teeth and gums. It hissed at me before abandoning its meal and disappearing into the house. The sight and smell drove me back outside, where I retched in the bushes before knocking on a neighbor's door to ask for help. I spent a few hours there, repeatedly explaining to the police why I was there and how I had found her. When they finally said I could leave, I got into my car and drove away without yet deciding where I would go. I had traveled about a mile before I heard a rustling sound in my back seat. It was a good thing that no one was behind me, because when I saw the Furby sitting against the passenger's side door, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car in a panic. It began laughing as I paced in the street with my hands pulling at the roots of my hair, but it was no longer the slow giggle. Instead, it was a heinous cackle, deep and clear. Tears of anger filled my eyes. I was tired of being scared, done with being bullied by something that I could hold in my hands. More than fed up, I decided to end this. I got back in the car and drove home, clutching the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white while trying to ignore the laughter and chants of bleed, die that came from the back seat. After parking in my driveway, I grabbed the doll by the ear and carried it to the backyard. I threw it in my charcoal grill, doused it with lighter fluid, and threw a match into the basin. I watched as the remaining fur and cloth burned away before the plastic underneath began to melt. The Furby wasn't laughing anymore. It screamed in agony, its voice getting lower and more distorted as it was reduced to a pile of black plastic goo. When it finally went silent, the flames changed from a bright red-orange to a deep green. Thick black smoke poured off of the mess as the flames died down, and it all ended with a bang that sounded as if someone shot a gun right next to my ear. In seconds, the fire went out completely and the smoke cleared. Relieved that the whole ordeal seemed to finally be over, I looked into the bottom of the grill to assess the damage. It was empty. Hey there, and thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, please leave a like. And if you like my videos and want to see more, subscribe to my channel. And I will see you all in my next video.